to have this in this manner. I don't think that I'm doing a classroom lecture, but I want to run a series of maps. A series of maps for us so that I can place us in a context where we see where this group is originating. We have there, as Dr. Shinek said, Boko Haram, which the name means Western education is an abomination. Welcome. Yes. So the group is situated in Nigeria. So the series of maps I'm running here now, you see, there are two maps of Africa with Nigeria spotted there. You see Nigeria with the one part shaded in the north, the one part shaded south. Before 1914, Nigeria was actually, quote, two separate entities. One called the Northern Protectorate, and the down one to the left, the Southern Protectorate. And these were British holdings. You see all the yellow areas there are British holdings in Africa. So in 1914, Frederick Rugard, the British administrator, merged the two groups into one to form what is now Nigeria. But in doing so, please have that map in mind. In doing so, during the time, Nigeria, the north and south, had two different administrative structures. One called indirect rule in the north, and in the south was direct rule. So that's what I want to explain shortly. In the north, we had limited colonial presence. In other words, there was a feudal system in the north, and which the British saw it as an advanced civilization in a way. So they used the emirs who had been conquered and who had accepted British rule as agents for their colonial enterprise. So the emirs retained their caliphate titles, they retained their territories, but were responsible to the British district officers. And so out of a sudden, these traditional caliphate officials were transformed into salary recipients and district head agents. And in the process, most of these emirs were Muslims. And what happened is that government activities were undertaken through these traditional rulers. And so, in order to avoid conflict, the colonial administrators also retained a dual system of law. They allowed the Sharia law to be part of governance in the north alongside the British common law. So the consequence was that the Fulani Hausa ethnic group became the dominant group in the north, such that they imposed their rule over diverse ethnic groups, especially people in the Middle Belt. The administrators also limited the activities of missionaries into the area. And so the consequence was that education and medical services in the north lagged behind those of the south. And the second thing is that the northern elites, these emirs, had come to see it as their natural right to govern. So that's the mentality that was created out of that. And so in the south, we have, in the south, because the system was different, there was no feudal system, especially in the east, the administrators could not impose indirect rule. And they saw what was happening in the east, where there were participatory governance. And they refer to it as village democracy. And so they had direct rule into the southern part of the country, ensuring that the administration of the country was undertaken directly by the colonial administrators. So what happened is that they allowed missionaries free lands into this area. And so we had schools, hospitals, and Christianity taking place down in the south. So by 1914, when the two entities were merged, it had been already, the divide was already there. So the two systems were retained. This is something very interesting, something to take note, that in the process, after Nigeria was merged, the indirect rule continued in the north, direct rule continued in the south for a long time, almost 46 years later. And so by independence in October, the central government had now become the center for contests for ethnic groups for entitlements. And to forge effort at national unity was a task that needed to be undertaken by the new administration. Unfortunately, they did not do a very good job in forging national identity. And so the ideological divide between North and South, and the sense that the northern elite felt the divine right to govern, continued. It is something that politicians have exploited and continue to exploit even today. So I want you to take a note also of another 3 series of maps: ethnicity and female literacy. You look at ethnicity on your left, and female literacy to your right of the map. And the darker it is this way, the higher the literacy rate. And so what has happened that, as you see that in the south that had direct rule, the literacy rate has gone much higher than it is in the northern part. And the same thing applies, you look at this, another set of map, female literacy versus infant health, that there is a correlation there between female literacy, thanks to Catholic nuns for the most part, who were very, very engaged in the southern part, and infant health. That's a current map. And thirdly, the divide that continues. This is the map of Nigeria on that side, showing states with Sharia on the left, and on the right is the map of presidential election in 2011. You see a pattern there? The current president won in all the states below, except for Osun State, where the ACN party, voted for another candidate. But there was a split in the vote, between North and South. And I want to say this, please, let's hold Islam aside for now, even though there's a factor, let's not immediately throw Islam as the driving factor here. I'm not saying that for us to remember the earlier map that I showed, namely the Northern Protectorate and the Southern Protectorate. And next, you also find where the GDP of Nigeria to the left and the oil-producing areas. So you see those tracks there are pipelines of oil from the south going to refineries in Yola, Guzo, Maiduguri, etc. So having said that, let me say something shortly about Boko Haram, because I said it's for the other panelists to talk about it. I just want to give the foundation here. Boko Haram is anchored in the context that I just played the series of maps there. And there had been similar groups before Boko Haram. A most pronounced one was the Matasine, which the name means the one who curses. This was a radical Islamic preacher from northwest Cameroon who had taken up residency in Nigeria, in Kano. And he was such a radical preacher, preaching hate, preaching against the authorities. I'm not talking about Christian authority, just authority in general, to the extent that the Sultan of Kano had him kicked out of the country. He found his way back and started preaching the same thing and gathered many followers, which eventually led to a riot and killing of about over 4,000 people. That was in 1980, 81, 82. And the same thing, Boko Haram, which the founder was trained in Mali and Chad. He did his Quranic studies there. And then came back and gathered a number of followers from northern Nigeria in the Maiduguri northeastern side and across Chad and into Niger as well. By the time they came to light in 2002, they had over 280,000 followers, from that region across Chad and into Niger. And so Matasine and Yusuf were said to have been very radical, that they opposed even the mainline Islam in the country, which they saw as, quote, pandering to the West. And so the skirmishes started initially as internal dispute within the Islamic community. The same thing happened with Matasine. It was the same thing with Boko Haram. It started as internal skirmishes and then spilled over. And of course, as it did, many politicians who had been waiting to exploit the divide that I showed earlier chipped in, to the extent that now it has grown into something else. But as I said, these politicians see these groups to justify the quest to use the federal government as an arena of contest for group entitlement. And so the divide also that shows in poverty up in the north, which is very dire, a group of young men, the Almajiris, who are recruited by these political elites to go around begging for them and bringing in whatever they beg to submit to their leaders, is such that they are easy recruits and easy targets for these groups, that they are easily recruited and sent out to cause mayhem. And so the ideological divide in many ways is so entrenched that many people in the South think that everybody up north is Muslim, which is not true, and vice versa. So when we talk about Christian South and Muslim North, it's really a misnomer. It's not exactly true. In fact, the southwestern part of Nigeria has many Muslims, and it's very common in a family to find, the former Bishop Emeritus of Ijebu-Ode, Bishop Sanusi, is a Catholic bishop. The rest of the family is Muslim, and they're getting along fine, in the Southwest. So that's very different. It is only as you go out into the extreme north where you find some of these radical preachers that they try to exploit religion, where religion and ideological divide becomes the rallying call for violence. And so, so I will stop there shortly, but the point is, like right now, as President Goodluck Jonathan said earlier in January, that Boko Haram and these elements, they have infiltrated all levels of government, which is something that we'll talk about later. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Do you need your glasses? Thanks. I have a pretty loud voice, but I'll use the microphone anyway, just in case. So I'm Carl Levan, and I teach African politics and political theory at American University up the street. And I really want to thank the Institute for including me in this really important event. I just finished writing a book on Nigeria, and as I count it, this is the third event this week in Washington, D.C. on Nigeria and focusing on Boko Haram. So issue du jour, I guess, as you say. And I also just returned from a field research trip where I was looking at two issues, and one of them, of course, was political strategies to deal with Boko Haram and a little bit at the origins of Boko Haram, but other scholars have covered that much better than I think I already will. What I want to outline today, first of all, I want to segue into what I have to say, maybe by giving a little bit of a political update that follows up on the excellent context that we have heard so far. And that is to maybe go back to 1999 and the transition to democracy in 1999. So Nigeria transitions from military rule to democratic rule in 1999 after the death of Sani Abacha in 1998, mysteriously. And part of the bargain among elites at the time was that that power needed to rotate between North and South, they call it power shift, that it would shift and alternate between North and South. Now, underlying that bargain was an understanding that the Southwest had lost out on its turn to rule at least once, arguably twice, in Nigerian history. And it took me several months of Nigerians explaining this to me in 2000 before I actually started to understand this and all of the various names. The first time was in 1979 during an earlier democratic transition when, like the United States a few years ago, the Supreme Court decided who would be president. And the second time was in 1993 when the military dictator Ibrahim Babangida annulled a presidential election that was presumably won by a Southwesterner, MKO Abiola. Those official results had never been released, and I tried to smuggle them out of the Electoral Commission about 8 years ago, and I was not successful, and there was shortly thereafter a fire in the Electoral Commission, so now we'll never know. So that brings us to 1999. So the South felt like they had really lost out, and that the North had been running the country for a long time and not doing a very good job. And there was an acceptance and an understanding by a number of really important Northerners that power needed to be shifted, not shared, shifted to the South. And this idea had been constitutionally discussed in 1995 and at a number of different legal conventions. So to implement this idea, it was not included in the 1999 Constitution. It was included, and it has been practiced as a pact among elites within the ruling party, the People's Democratic Party, the PDP, which is the instrument, with the ruling party and now the instrument for implementing this power shift agreement between North and South. So from 1999 to 2007, a Southerner, Olusegun Obasanjo, ruled the country. And then in 2007, power shifted back to the North, and the president of the North died in 2010. And for those of you who don't know the details, the circumstances surrounding his death are just fascinating. And there happened to be a vice president who was from the South. And so power shifted unexpectedly back to the South in 2010, even though it was not, quote unquote, the South's turn to rule. So in 2011, there was another presidential election, And the vice president, Goodluck Jonathan, ran for the presidency, which of course violated this understanding, which had gone back to 1999, that that power would alternate between North and South. And this understanding, this idea of rotating power, is actually replicated at different units of political scale throughout the country, not only all the way down to each of the 774 local government areas, but actually within each of those local government areas. And so there's a whole critique within political science, and I'm a political scientist, which suggests that that's something that in the long run undermines accountability. But that's another story. So these are the circumstances under which we find Nigeria in 2012 being ruled by a southern president who has struggled and I would say failed to gather a good deal of support among the North. And this is exactly why that map of the electoral results is very important. But I also think to a certain degree it can be misleading. I put that exact same map up at American University last July for a conference for an organization organized by, an organization called NIDO, Nigerians in the Diaspora. And each summer they have a conference. And we talked about that, and they said, that's not the whole story. And so on the one hand, it's really important to understand that there are these significant cultural, historical, economic, and political differences and religious differences between North and South, and that these have translated to different electoral behaviors. But it's also really important not to, to note that that's not the whole story. For example, most of the worst rigging and electoral fraud in the 2011 elections was not in the North, in fact. And so the fact that you have millions of Northerners who voted for a Southern candidate at all, I would take as a sign of potential encouragement. And indeed, I interviewed on the record founders of the People's Democratic Party from the North, from the elite Sokoto caliphates and others, saying, power shift was important for the transition, but maybe it's outliving its utility. Maybe we're reaching a point where people just want to vote for the best man, or best woman as the case may be, although that doesn't quite happen as often as it should in Nigeria. So if I have a few minutes, what I'd like to do then is then sort of segue into something which is skipping forward a little bit, and that is to outline what might be done about this, what could be done about Boko Haram, and lessons to be learned from recent conflicts in Nigeria, recent conflict resolution processes, and just thinking in comparative terms about this. There are some lessons here that I'm drawing on from a paper that I wrote that also critiques the U.S. strategy for handling Boko Haram. But I just want to take a step back from that and think about this in sort of broader, more general terms. To start with, I think that one of the little noticed sort of hidden shifts after 9/11 in the way policy planners approach security has been a shift to build capacity. And that is, in broad terms, a dramatic shift from what democracy promoters and policy implementers were very focused on in the 1980s and 1990s. But getting to Nigeria's conflict, what this has meant has been oftentimes a heavy-handed response. That capacity building has meant responding with force. And fortunately, in the last few years, there has been a learning curve on this, but the learning curve didn't really kick in until it was a little bit too late. And the key turning point that I think virtually all Nigeria analysts around town agree was in 2009. And you alluded to this as well. In 2009, Muhammad Yusuf, who was the leader of Boko Haram, was captured by the military and turned over to the police for prosecution, except the police didn't prosecute him. They killed him in public, and the murder ended up on YouTube. Not a whole lot, I guess, has changed since I lived in Ibadan in 2004, and the police used to leave bodies outside the polo club to show that they were catching criminals. So the first lesson about how to handle this, I think, comes from the Niger Delta conflict. The Niger Delta is the area in Nigeria where most of the oil comes from, all the oil comes from, and virtually all of the government's revenues, especially its export earnings. And so the Niger Delta conflict began many, many years ago, but it really became significant around 2003, 2004, when militant groups started to organize and articulate claims that had been laid out in a statement of youth groups and civil society organizations in 1999, basically saying oil has polluted our communities, our women have been attacked, our children have been attacked, our villages have been bombed from the air by the Nigerian military, and politics isn't solving the problem, so people started picking up guns to handle it. And when the important lesson from that, and this is the takeaway, the first bullet point, militarization of the Niger Delta conflict facilitated radicalization among the militants. And that's really important to think about, because what that means is that, again, as with the murder of Muhammad Yusuf in the north in 2009, there was a long learning curve. It took several years for the Nigerian government to realize that there was a great deal of interest and support among civil society groups, among activists on the ground, and then eventually among the militants who they were liaising with, that they were willing to move forward to some sort of political solution, and that there was a light at the end of the tunnel. Now, for a variety of reasons we can maybe talk about during the Q&A, I think it's going to be a little bit harder to get Boko Haram to a comparable juncture, in part because its goals, despite the literal translation of the name, are not entirely clear. And they do an awfully lousy job, in my view, of articulating those goals. And some fragmentation of the group, which Assistant Secretary of State Carson acknowledged this week in his comments at the Center for International Studies, makes it harder to negotiate. Now, the Niger Delta militant groups also fragmented, but they were loosely unified around a few identifiable goals, particularly the rhetoric of resource control, the reality of environmental cleanup, and just development for the region in general. Homogenizing the group, I think, is also related to internationalizing the group. I've been at a number of conferences where I've heard or where I've read, military officers equate the organization. Indeed, I've seen diplomats equate the organization in the U.S. government with a jihadist group. And on the one hand, there clearly is an Islamist agenda there. There are some relevant international inspirations and connections, but the key, again, I think, is the comparison to the 1982 Maitastani uprising, which is much, much more localized and much more historical. In fact, a number of Nigerian historians argue that 2 points on that. One is that a number of Nigerian historians argue that there's very little historical basis in the 1800s for Sharia in the north to be enforced at the level of criminal law. I'm not sure that's accurate, and that's something that perhaps others can enlighten us about. But nevertheless, that is one of the prevailing mainstream interpretations. Secondly, along those lines, is a very important intellectual discussion happening at Bayero University in the north and elsewhere across the north, and even in the editorial pages of the newspapers today, which is to say that maybe Sharia isn't about criminal law primarily at all. Maybe the criminal component of Sharia is secondary. In much the same way, I think there was a constructive rethinking in 2002, 2003 in the United States about what jihad actually meant. I think many of us remember the newspaper article saying, well, jihad doesn't necessarily mean war. It means purification of the soul, and purification of the self and your own ethics. And so the debate happening in the North intellectually and at the grassroots and in the newspapers is whether Sharia indeed means chopping off people's hands for stealing, or if it in fact lends itself more to development and solving exactly those kind of developmental differences that we saw on those excellent PowerPoint slides. That Sharia in fact means development, and that now it's been the North's turn to be neglected. And I think I'm probably running out of time, or perhaps being selfish. You never give a professor a microphone without a clock. So how do we get there, and what else can we look to, I think, arguably for a source of hope? When I teach, there's always a clock at the other end of the classroom. One is that I think there are what I have described as endogenous sources of moderation in Nigeria. These debates about Sharia and religion and Islamic law have been debated again and again and again since the 1950s. And every single time the compromise is very, very similar. What's a little bit different this time around is that the Northerners advocating for Sharia have picked up guns, and that there is a real risk of the conflict expanding and the players involved multiplying and their goals multiplying. At a very local level, we had the 12 states that declared Sharia starting in 1999 and then mostly in 2000, and I was in some of those states in 2000. And trust me, at the height of the Sharia craze, it was never difficult to find a beer. And one of the interesting things is that the governors and the politicians in virtually all of those states, or in several of the key states, I should say, pleaded with business officials not to leave, and non-Northerners not to leave the state, because they understood that those people were now part of the community, part of the economy, and part of the polity. So again, that's a second source of, I think, endogenous moderation. In terms of the Sharia debate, I think that means that there's a historical and theological basis for moderation. And for us, this is very remote and very abstract, and for those of you who are new to Nigeria, maybe this is difficult to digest, but this stuff is real, and you wouldn't believe the level of historical analysis that plays out on the pages of the Nigerian newspapers on this stuff. And the last and final lesson, I think, is that there's actually pretty widespread popular support, elite support, and civil society support for non-military solutions. And that has played out that's evident in polls by the Clean Foundation, which is funded in part by Western money, but is a Nigerian grassroots organization that looks at law enforcement. Senior security officials within the government have questioned whether counterterrorism and the heavy-handed tactics of the police have undermined them, have undermined dealing with Boko Haram. Just today, the State Security Service, no friend of mine, I suppose, since they've detained me in the past, said that it's necessary to maintain the support of the local population in order to solve this problem, and signaling very strongly and clearly in rhetorical terms in the newspaper that heavy-handed tactics aren't going to help. So, again, I'm skimming this out of a paper that I've prepared, and so I hope I've summarized it in a coherent way, but those are my thoughts. And so, as scary as this is, and as scary as it was, quite frankly, a few weeks ago in Nigeria, there are some avenues that suggest there's a light at the end of the tunnel.
Good afternoon. It's with great pleasure that I join here. Our chairman. Our chairman pointed out a very important fact, that we are neighbors at Howard, but we have not jointly been discussing Nigeria or any other African issue. I used to come here and speak to professors' classes over the years. But recently we did an organization, we organized a conference at Howard looking at Nigeria. The Nigerian ambassador was there with me, and then we had somebody from the Department of State in the office of the Assistant Secretary of State looking at Nigeria. Of course, Boko Haram came as one of the issues addressed. I think 7 points I want to emphasize in the course of this conversation. What can take weeks to analyze. Scholars here and others can just share with you 15 minutes. So within a span of 15 minutes, I will try to raise 7 points to remember with regard to Nigeria. You already had a very powerful PowerPoint with regard to the geopolitical history of Nigeria, how Nigeria, an idea, came into being. A country that owes its name to the girlfriend and later wife of Lugard, Frederick Lugard, a British colonial officer from India who went to Uganda and ended up in Nigeria. And his legacy is what we call Nigeria today. So if you look at that PowerPoint, a number of points will come to your mind. Number one, the idea, Nigeria, is now real. There are many people who are born under Nigeria. Their memory, they're all capsules of consciousness. There are millions of Nigerians who are capsules of consciousness, and their egos and their lives revolve around the idea of Nigeria. So the concept of Nigeria is new. Nigeria is one of 7 countries in Africa which all have the same name, black nation. Sudan, Ethiopia, if you know Greek, you know Ethiop means what? Black. And you go to Sudan, you go to Mauritania, you go to the Guinea-Bissau, these are all Berber word for black. Now, if you come back to Nigeria, what you see very clearly in Nigeria is this. Nigeria is an idea, a concept that came from British colonialism. The British were fighting the Muslims in India and other parts of the world. So Nigeria was one of the conquests of the British. So Nigeria as an idea came out of the British narrative. The British were fighting the Ottoman Empire, and they and the French inherited much of Africa. And that is why European colonialism, European imperialism, and the Nigerian product resulted out of that. Americans today are the beneficiaries of this narrative. And when you look at the situation here, what you have to recognize is that the Boko Haram is just one episode in that long struggle of tension between the Muslim Nigerian and the Nigerian people. Now, when you look at the map here, what comes out very clearly as your second point is that who is a Nigerian? What is a Nigerian? What makes you a Nigerian? The Nigerian is a result of the decolonization process. The legacies of Kwame Nkrumah and others to create a United States of Africa echo in Nigeria. One of the reasons why Nigerians are facing a problem today is that during the Nkrumah success, Azikiwe, Awolowo, and all those other leaders out of Nigeria were on the bandwagon of decolonization. As a result of that bandwagon, Nigerians developed the same attitude as the Ghanaians. They want to have a unitary state, but Nigeria is too difficult to be a unitary state. Kwame Nkrumah imposed a unitary state on Ugandans, Kenyans, and the rest of Africa. And as a result, Nigeria became the only African country, except South Africa, with a republic and federalism. All the others were unitary states. As a result, the issue you saw here with regard to the geopolitics and the ethnography of Nigeria is the fact in Nigeria is too diverse a population to have a unitary government. It ended as a federal system. So that second point leads to a one-party dictatorship. Kwame Nkrumah had a one-party dictatorship. Nigerians could not have a one-party dictatorship. What happened in Nigeria? They have what? The military became the first one-party dictatorship. The politicians cannot get together to unite the country the way Kwame Nkrumah was organizing in Ghana or Obote was doing in other places, or Kenyatta in Kenya. The military became the unifying force for Nigeria. They became the super tribe. So tribalism in Nigeria was subordinated to military dictatorship. And that's what we are inheriting now. this leads you to the third point I'm making for you. If you look at the Nigerian crisis right now, the Boko Haram is the same kind of problem facing those leaders with one-party dictatorships in Africa. They don't want any opposition. Now, what is tragic for Nigeria is that if you look at the map again, in terms of westernization of Nigerian society, the most westernized were the southerners. The least westernized were the northerners. And this is part of British policy. The British did not allow missionaries to operate in the north. The British won that contest by having indirect rule. Look at and Kitchener and others in Sudan. Just look at Sudan and Nigeria. The British were, that's why they have the same polarization in Sudan existed also in Nigeria. Now, what is the third point that has to be emphasized when you look at the Nigerian situation is ethnicity and religion coming together. Nigerians were not thinking in religious times when they were independent, no. They mobilized themselves along ethnic lines and regional lines. That's how they mobilized themselves. Azikiwe became the president of Nigeria. He was a southerner. But he was able to negotiate with the northerners, and they link up with him against Awolowo from the west. So he became the president of Nigeria with northern support. And he was Igbo. But the one-party dictatorship will lead to a crisis. And this is where you come to your fourth point with regard to the Nigerian situation. If you look at the Nigerian situation, what you have, and this is what most of the scholars who write about Nigeria or look at Nigeria, grapple with this. How do you explain ethnicity and religion in Nigerian politics? And the Boko Haram is coming. I'm coming to them. That's why if you look at the Boko Haram, you see that they are a northern group, but they are not from all the north. They're from Maiduguri area. They're from one part of Nigeria. There's a reason why the political economy, political psychology of Nigeria will explain why you have the Boko Haram, and why you have the Maitatsine during Babangida time. This is why you now come to the ethnicity and religion in Nigerian politics. When you come to this, the Yoruba factor in Nigerian politics. The moment the Nigerian Yorubas are divided along religious lines, halas, Nigeria is gone. Because the Yorubas, they are the mind in metaphors. If you talk about the canary in the mine, miners, they send the canary down. When it is dangerous, the canary will never come back. The moment the Yorubas become divided along ethnic lines, and the first speaker makes it very clear to you, the Yorubas, they are Muslims and Christians together. So that's one reason why the Yorubas will be most affected with regard to the Boko Haram group. They will certainly oppose the Boko Haram because the Boko Haram is a major threat to the Yorubas. If you try to introduce religion, you divide the Yorubas. One of our scholars, David Lighton, an American sociologist, addressed this issue very clearly. The hegemony of culture in Nigerian society. So this is your fourth point. Lugard and his story, the idea, the concept, and the movement which leads to Nigerianization. Then the fact that Nigerians didn't go with Kwame Nkrumah. They didn't have a one-party state. They had a federalism, and the military become the imposition of one-party state. Now, this is where you come now to the legacy of people like Leopold Senghor. Leopold Senghor was influenced by Kwame Nkrumah. But the legacy of Senghor to Africa is that he was a one-party dictator who decided that I always say that the Catholics have given us good leaders and bad leaders. They gave us the Nyerere and the Senghor. They are Catholics, but what they have done for the Africans, they were the first Africans to come towards a democratic government. Nyerere and Senghor. Senghor the first one. When Senghor came to Senegal, he introduced democracy, and he was able to move away from one-party dictatorship. And you see what the Senegalese are doing now in terms of their situation. You have transition, you have power, relationship. So when you look at Nigeria now, you go back to my fifth point. What is happening in Nigeria is that the political leadership in Nigeria has been very much affected by political corruption and the use of power. And this is one of the major problems of Nigeria. How do you govern this society and use the resources well? This is why you have dictators like Babangida. They call him Maradona. And they gave him a metaphor that he is able to play and dribble the Nigerian leadership and take games with them, with the natural resources. So this is why you have your fifth point with regard to Nigeria. So if you look at Nigeria, since the founding fathers to now, the 60 years of governance, Nigerians have been trying to figure out how do we deal with ethnicity and religion. As I told you, when the founding fathers came, they were not thinking in terms of religion. They were very much ethnic. That's why you have an inheritance from Lugard. They created the North and the South. And then, because of ethnicity, the Westerners were split. You have the Western region, which was a way of creating a demarcation line between the East and the West. And you left the North alone. So when they had the Civil War, this is why Ojukwu is now dead. The legacy of Ojukwu. If Ojukwu succeeded in Nigeria, the way the leadership in Eritrea succeeded, or now the Southern Sudanese succeeded, you have a different story for Nigeria. Lugard would have been revisited. And the whole history of Nigeria will be different today. This leads me to my last point. When you look at the Nigerian situation and think about Boko Haram, see how leadership and the use of government become very critical here. This is why the last speaker mentioned the question of the Niger Delta. The Boko Haram group, I'm on record. If I am an advisor to Jonathan, I will not negotiate with terrorists. When George Bush faced 9/11, which worked for him, because Americans were now united over a very tricky election in this country in 2000. After we have 9/11, we never talk about that election anymore. George Bush was saved by 9/11. He was able now to get the Americans mobilized against an enemy. And then after 9/11, George Bush was able to run and get elected by the American people. Now, when you go back to the Nigerian situation, what you find here is that now, after the election of the new president, and points have been raised with regard to zoning in Nigeria, that's a big issue for Nigerians. The big problem is this: the Boko Haram is the mirror image of the Maitasine for Babangida. When Babangida took power, if you look at the Nigerian story very well, they call him Maradona because he can manipulate the Nigerians. When you look at Babangida, when he took power in Nigeria, he was facing a problem. Babangida is the one who is responsible for the first Yoruba Muslim president of Nigeria. He was prevented from taking power. And you know what happened? He was cooped out of power by Abacha. And Abacha took over the leadership of Nigeria. He died. There are a lot of stories about his death. But the big problem for Nigerians to recognize is that the Niger Delta issue confronted the problem for Sehu Sagari Jr. This was Obasanjo's story. Before I say that as an analyst, I will calm down. If you look at the Nigerian story here, the ethnic narrative, Ojukwu is dead. If he succeeded, we have a different story today. The whole narrative would have been written. What is critical for Nigerians today is how do you deal with this new reality? I have big debates with Nigerians about this issue in classes and in lectures around the country and elsewhere in the world. The big problem is this. Jonathan's presidency is a major development for Nigeria. And I've been one of the scholars coming out very strongly for him. Because for the first time, you have a minority. Nigeria has been led by Yorubas, Igbos, and Hausa Fulanis. They never had a minority. If you're familiar with the history of Nigerian political development, minorities, when they went to Lancaster House to get their independence, there was a big debate about minorities in Nigeria. The Nigerian minorities were not given anything. The only thing fortunate for Nigeria is that when they had a coup, and many people were killed in the first coup d'etat, and people like Azikiwe was not killed, he left the country. And the people who were killed were from the north and people from the south. Occurred to Ebo from the Midwest. And you have Akintola, who was a Yoruba guy. Now, the big crisis which led to the crisis in Nigeria is very relevant for this case here. And that is, if you are looking at Boko Haram, in my opinion, what I will tell Jonathan, you are a minority, you are not a Yoruba, you are not a Hausa, but you are a minority. And for the first time, you have a right to rule Nigeria. Make sure that you don't bargain with these extremists who will divide the society. Hit them. Babangida was able to destroy Maitasine ruthlessly. If you go to the Library of Congress, you will have a 1,000-page report on the proceedings of that Commission of Inquiry which look at the Maitasine. They were crushed. My advice to him on public record, go after these terrorists. Don't allow them to play with you. and don't let any external forces, because the danger for us, and these 2 points I want to emphasize, the Boko Haram will get international support because of 9/11 and all these Islamic groups that are operating. That is the danger for Nigeria, because the Islamic groups will use it. I have always argued in the State Department, 2 major American problems after the Cold War. The rivalry between the 2 fundamentalist cartels, Islamic fundamentalist cartels and Christian fundamentalist cartels. If you're in America here, the FBI arrested some groups who are seen as likely supporters of groups who are fundamentalists. And in the United States, the New York Times people reported very well that if you look at what is happening, these groups, whether they're radical Christian or Muslims, are very dangerous to modernity. And that's one of the reasons why we have to pay attention to the narrative. So if you look at the Boko Haram, you don't give them an inch. We have to crush them. And I'm on record that they should be crushed by force. That's the only way you deal with extremists. Thank you.
Hi, folks. What do you prefer? Do you prefer the microphone or the just talking straight at you? Okay. You prefer the microphone?
Yeah. No,
And everybody else said no?
She does.
Okay.
She does. Yeah.
Okay. To hold it. To leave it at the desk. But to make sure that I stand right here and not move. Okay. Okay, that sounds good. I'll try to fulfill the criteria. So my name is Gus Fay. I work at the State Department, and I cover Nigeria for the Bureau of African Affairs. So I'm what's called a desk officer. So I sit at my desk all day in Washington, and I think about Nigeria. That's what you're paying me to do. So thanks. So and it's a delight to be here at such a prestigious university. And to see such the interest in Nigeria and this complicated issue of Boko Haram, I'm really glad that you're here and you want to hear more about it. Because, quite frankly, I'm always surprised on news reports that come out. Sometimes it's a little frustrating to me that the issues can get so simplified. They have to be for news accounts for people to understand them, but sometimes I think they can be misleading. And so I really thank my colleagues here for providing more context on how we can think about Boko Haram. And I'm going to try to do that same thing too, and hopefully not make it too complicated that that you feel like it's impossible to understand this problem. But so I'm going to give you first sort of an overview of the State Department's view of Nigeria in general, and that'll give a context on how your government is responding to this group. And then talk about some of the issues that people have touched on, because I sense that that's sort of the interest in the room. So talk about Sharia, talk about sort of Boko Haram in other ways that haven't really been covered. And then we'll talk about, what can we do? Because that always comes down to what action are we going to take? People are always very interested in that, and as well they should be. So first, let's think about Nigeria. We don't look at any particular problem in isolation, and so we see Nigeria as being such an important player on the world stage, not only because of its massive population, 160 million, it's bigger than Russia, it's the 7th largest country in the world, but they play a very important role regionally at the African Union, in ECOWAS, the regional organization, and at the UN, where they just completed a 2-year term on the UN Security Council. And so we were always working in collaboration with them on other problems around the world, like Libya or Iran or other US priorities. So they're an important partner for us on the world stage. If you've been following West African affairs, Guinea, Niger, Mali. You asked about Mali the other day, didn't you? Yeah, I thought I recognized you. And, well, there's one other, Cote d'Ivoire. These are all constitutional crises that came up in the last 2 years, And Nigeria played a very important role in making sure that they were resolved. And so for those of us, so if you're in America and you care about Africa policy, you have to work with African partners that are going to, they're really going to be the people that help to solve these kinds of problems. And Nigeria has been a great friend of ours in that respect, and so we feel like they're a good partner of ours. So we have set up all these different mechanisms to make sure that we're talking about these kinds of issues on a regular basis. And so I usually like to tell American audience about the U.S.-Nigeria Binational Commission, which was something inaugurated by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in 2010 that formalizes certain high-level discussions to make sure that we're being proactive on all the issues that we care about, and so that we're not just sort of responding to current events as they come up. So, so yeah, for all these things that I've mentioned, they're Africa's largest peacekeeper. So they send peacekeeping troops to all over the place, including Darfur. Not to mention they're a big oil producers, so if there's a shutdown in oil in Nigeria, it affects world markets all over the place. But there's one aspect of it that I think is often overlooked, but I think is very relevant to this conversation, and that's that Nigeria is by far the largest country in the world that has about equal Christian and Muslim populations. So it can really tell us a lot about how we live in a pluralistic world. And as was already expressed here, there's great examples of, especially in the Southwest, of Christians and Muslims living together and I guess you could say not only accommodating one another, but sort of living in love, living in peace. And there are other places where ethnic and religious tensions sort of blend together and have led to disaster clashes, especially in Plateau State, in the city called Jos, that's sort of right in the middle of Nigeria. And so we really have to look at these things, that if we want to live in a pluralistic world, what are Nigerians doing right, and what's happening that's exacerbating religious tensions. And so I really regard Boko Haram as a group that's intentionally exacerbating ethnic and religious tensions for their own political or military gain. So they'll go up, they'll try to blow up a church in Jos, this area I just mentioned, as a way of sparking religious riots, or ethno-religious riots is a better way of putting it. And I feel like that's a military tactic to make sure the security forces are looking at Jos and not looking at where they are in the Northeast or northwestern states. So I think it's really their intention, by saying such exasperating statements about Christians get out of the north, you have 3 days to go, or attacking places where Southern traders come and meet. They're really hoping that there's a response in the South, where Southerners attack, Southern Christians attack Southern Muslims, and all, because there is really this opportunity for all these different flashpoints around. So I want to keep that in mind, because for those of us in the United States and those of us that think about these issues, or if you're in the diaspora, you don't want to play into that. You don't want to paint Boko Haram as a broad brush, oh, these are Muslims, these are Muslim extremists, when really most Muslims, just like most Christians in Nigeria, absolutely abhor their ideology and abhor their tactics as well. So if you're Christian and you care about Christian minorities being attacked in the north, then your best bet is to find your Muslim brothers and sisters up there and find alliances with them and protect Muslim minorities in the south as well. And so we really have to be careful, especially for advocacy groups back here, not to raise these tensions even more, because that feeds into Boko Haram's tactics, I feel. Okay, so let's see, what else do I want to cover? Oh, I wanted to talk about Sharia. Other folks have hit on it here, but I see Sharia as being having such popular support in the North after the 1999 elections, because most people on the ground saw Sharia as being a way to justice, to anti-corruption, and to rule of law problems. That they are looking at all of this inequality that's in the North, and they're saying this is un-Islamic. And they're looking at the corruption, and they're looking at the breakdown of law and order, and they're looking at elites getting away with all of this business and saying we need a religious answer that we all understand to hold these elites accountable for all these declining social indices in the North. And that's why there was such a popular groundswell in the early 2000s, and that's why it's been such a profound disappointment to Muslims in the North, because they see Sharia as failing in that initial, for its initial reason for being, because it hasn't stopped corruption and it hasn't stopped, it hasn't had elites become accountable. And that, so this widespread feeling that government is not on their side, government is not helping them out, government is making their problem worse, is just a narrative that's ripe for an extremist group to hijack. And that's what Boko Haram has done, and I would argue that even if Boko Haram were to go away tomorrow, it's still, the North is still vulnerable to these kinds of movements. So government very much needs to address this narrative and demonstrate that they are addressing these large-scale grievances that happen in the North. So let's keep that in mind. And so also, just because of the title of this series of this forum is Western Education is an Abomination, I think that also ties in with this dissatisfaction that most Northerners have with elites. So it's not like that they're against Western education, but they're looking at all of these high-level guys and they're saying, hey, you went off to Britain to be educated, and then you come back and steal from us? You know, this doesn't make any sense. And so they associate this elite core with going outside of Nigeria and bringing back these great ideas and then not using them for the benefit of the general public. So Western education is sin. I think that's a real misnomer, and when I see it in the press, really I see it as more of like an anti-elite kind of saying, not an anti-education kind of saying. Because the fact is that most leaders in Boko Haram, have Western educations and are perfectly, aren't giving those kinds of things out. All right. Let's see. I touched on those things. Yeah. The other part of the title, Boko Haram, I think another mistake that we run into is that we say this name, Boko Haram, and then just by saying the name, we associate it with being a monolithic kind of group. And that's really far from the truth. The way we see it at the State Department is different factions that for either reasons of convenience or just because of different relationships fall under the name of, we consider under the name of Boko Haram. But in general, I would say there's sort of these two different points of focus. One is in the Northeast that's really anti-government, that feels like the extrajudicial killing of their leader in 2009 has been the basis of this escalating war against the government, and they want to bring down the government. Then there is this other group that's sort of much smaller, but that has probably these international connections that are much more anti-Western, more in general. And so we see them as being responsible for attacks like the attack on the UN headquarters in August, and responsible for kidnapping of Europeans in the North. So they're really sort of two different groups that are often at odds with one another, at least two different groups that are often at odds with one another. And in addition, if you're a common criminal, or if you're a political thug now, and you want to do payback to somebody, you just take the Boko Haram tactics, you get on a motorcycle, you get a gun, and you rob a bank. And if you're wearing the right headdress, then people will point to that and say Boko Haram. And if you're a criminal, great, you just had the attention, is looking away from you. Boko Haram also benefits because it seems like Boko Haram is everywhere now. And quite frankly, sometimes I worry that the Nigerian government benefits too, because then that can justify their heavy-handed tactics that they use to go after Boko Haram. And so I really take issue with this idea that we have to just crush Boko Haram, because in fact the Nigerian government has had heavy-handed attempts to address Boko Haram have been absolutely counterproductive for a couple different reasons. One, they usually miss. So there's an attack somewhere in Maiduguri, then the security forces come in and they just start mowing people down. So innocent civilians are invariably the people that suffer most from these kinds of responses from the Nigerian government. The second thing is, when you have these extrajudicial killings, it just feeds into the recruitment narrative for Boko Haram. They've been telling people all along that the Nigerian government doesn't care one bit about them, that it's criminal, that it doesn't follow the law. And so every time you have one of these extrajudicial killings or human rights abuses, then it feeds into that narrative, it builds public support outside of Boko Haram, and then it helps the recruitment, it makes them stronger. So in terms of the US and how do we respond to this, we see it's primarily as being, it's got to be Nigerian-led. It's not something that the US government itself can go and solve. And we want to help, and we have been helping in terms of bomb investigations or sending FBI teams out there. We've been trying to help, we've been looking into helping their security services share information better, and we've been helping out with different kinds of trainings, including human rights trainings that we do. But we have to be very careful, because we don't want to associate ourselves with these human rights abuses that are happening on the Nigerian government side. And we don't want to do things that encourage that as well. So as far as we're concerned, there's got to be a much more comprehensive approach to this. We've got to get at those underlying grievances. We've got to get some of these social indicators that were up on the slides before moving in the right direction. Some of those things are going to take a long time. So in addition to all the socioeconomic work, there needs to be some important symbolic actions taken by the Nigerian government. And since this is a southern-based presidency, we feel like there's got to be much more outreach to northern Nigeria to demonstrate to northerners that this government is on your side. And so appointing somebody high level that's responsible for socioeconomic development in the north, the equivalent of the Niger Delta Development Commission or a ministry official that's devoted just to northern affairs. It's much poorer in the north than it is in the Niger Delta or anywhere else in Nigeria, and that's really got to be turned around. So that in essence is what your government is doing. We're trying to work with our Nigerian partners to have a more comprehensive and successful approach to Boko Haram. And I'll just leave it at that. Thanks so much.
I think it makes sense to immediately go to questions, but if I could structure it just a little bit, I'd like to open the floor first for a couple of broad questions. Questions, up from the 35,000-foot level about the situation and approaches to it. Before we get to specifics and too deeply into the weeds and what policies might be the right policies to pursue here, I think it would be benefit for everybody if we posed a couple of questions from some distance. So, but the floor is open. Yes, ma'am.
Mine might be from some distance. I am a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion in Emory. My name is Christy Green. And I'm actually here today because I have been editing a blog, and we call it a blog and resource website on Sharia, family, and democracy in Nigeria and beyond for the last 2 years. We're kind of leading the project. And one of the things that I struggle with in the fields of both law and religion is a tendency in law to kind of see religion as very separate from the state along the American separationist model. And in religion, academic religious studies in particular, we see religion as also sort of insulated from the state and wanting to see it as very pure. But as a result of some work that I've been doing, including this project and beyond, and I've been working on Nigeria
fascinating. Yeah.
where their Muslim Christian concerns. I have a question about religion, which is the general question is sort of when are things really about religion and when is religion a proxy for other concerns? I often hear that religion is a proxy for other concerns in Nigeria and other sub-Saharan African countries. But in a way, to my mind, is a religion scholar which sort of marginalizes religion, doesn't take it seriously enough. It's not never really about religion. So I wanted to know what the panel thinks about this idea, and in particular, if any of you have had any reading or work with the Pew Foundation, Pew Forum's recent Tolerance and Tension Survey on Muslim-Christian relations, which does tend to play
Right.
the tension thing. And I guess the encouraging thing I heard both in Professor Leanne's remarks about there possibly being theological underpinnings of moderation in some of the discussion of Sharia and Christianity, and also in Mr. Beatty's remarks about the role of religion as well. That there could be a more positive story about religion's role here. And then the second brief but also big question, in some of this research and monitoring of the news on Nigeria, I've come across people saying that perhaps Nigeria needs to split, like South Sudan, analogy. So I wondered what people think about that. So when is it about religion and should Nigeria split?
Okay, all right. Let's divide these into two pieces. Who'd like to take the religion question first? Father Akure?
I'll take the second one.
I'll do either one. Okay. I guess I'll take the easy one first. Should Nigeria split? You want to do that one? Well, okay, I'll start backwards then. So, when is it really about religion? When is it not? One of the reasons why I think we went into the background on colonialism and on the last several cycles of elections and transitions of democracy is because on a macro historical level, you could make an argument that there is a pattern that the uprising in the Niger Delta and the uprising in the Northeast today is sort of about regional leverage, that people in that region feel alienated and disconnected from formal politics and formal means of representation, and so they pick up guns and they get angry. And I don't mean to belittle that, but what I'm getting at is that there is sort of this north-south difference. Plateau State came up, and I just finished doing some very unusual research in the slums outside Abuja, and one of the things that happened in Plateau State is a lot of the violence is really about indigene versus settler citizenship terms, and a similar process is playing out in the greater Abuja area, which is largely being ignored, I think, which could very easily be misinterpreted as religious because of differences among the groups who are being affected. As a foreigner, sometimes it's tricky, I think, to say that religion is being abused for external reasons. I, of course, see myself as a scientist first. I think it is encouraging to say that when the North splitting off has come up in the Nigerian media or in elite discussions, it's just been absolutely, I think, ridiculed or dismissed as something plausible. If there was a split, northern Nigeria would end up, a extremely poor, highly illiterate country without any resources in a dry, dusty climate. So it's not in their interests. So that comes back to, why is this violence happening? Is there some sort of effort to get access to power so that resources can be distributed better?
In terms of splitting the country, if the country didn't succeed with Biafra, it's over. Because since then, there's been so much investment around the country, from the south to the north and vice versa. And Abuja, for example, Abuja was created to be, quote, a centerpiece of unity. You know, the capital used to be in Lagos, and so the government wanted a place that, not only that Lagos was so congested, which it still is, but to have a capital that would be built from the ground up where every part of the country is represented. So people don't, the idea of splitting comes up again and again, but it's ridiculed. It's not possible. That time is over. In fact, one coup plotter almost succeeded in overthrowing General Babangida. He was an army colonel from Bendel State, you know, the Midwest state. And he got a lot of support because there is another, in Nigeria, we believe that Babangida is the epitome of corruption. You know, that's a common agreement in the country. But when he took over Dodan Barracks at the time, which was the residence of the commander-in-chief, many of the brigade commanders in Northeast and Northwest supported him. But then he went on the radio and said, as from now on, he has expelled the North from Nigeria. And so all those generals who supported him immediately mounted a counter coup and crushed him. So dividing Nigeria, it's over. Those days are over. Yeah. And just to chip in on the religious factor, there is really, and I don't think there can be any, when we talk about separation of church and state or religion from state, you know, the dynamics of religion in an African context is so involved in life that you can't just make a clear-cut distinction that this is politics, this is religion. It's interwoven, you know, even though more so with Islam than with Christianity, but nonetheless, people see it as part and parcel of daily life. So in that case, sometimes ethnic tensions gets interpreted as religious and otherwise. But it's the reason that I kept looking at that map. I said, look at the ideological divide rather than Islam, Christianity, you know. Okay.
I'd like to take a shot too at the religion question, and in part because I too am also frustrated with this underplaying of religion in some of these affairs. In part because it's so interwoven into political life, and in part because the cultures of Africa and Asia are much more communal than the ones say in Europe or the United States. So it's not just about individual rights; it's about how you act and live in a community. And so when we try to separate religion from these other kinds of issues, I'm often worried that it reflects our own biases, just for the reasons that you mentioned, because we separate them out and we don't talk about religion in polite company. Thank you. But it is important, but it's also tied in with these other things. So when we talk about communal violence in the Middle Belt, people here just mentioned about these citizenship issues. Those are key. Other political issues that revolve around elections, because elections are so high stakes, such high stakes enterprises. And then economic kinds of issues or economic strains, because of just the increase in population, these formerly mutually beneficial relationships with herders coming through and bringing their animals through farmland and passing manure on that farmland. What used to be a good relationship now, because of population pressures, the balance is overthrown, and so you have tensions between different ethnic groups with different livelihoods, and those ethnic groups also have different religions as well. So religion is often an activating factor for people. If the newspaper says, it's Muslims killing Christians or vice versa, that activates different communities around the country to get involved in the fight, to get on their side. And let's not forget that activism also reaches back to our own country here And so there's an incentive for especially Christian advocacy groups, because there's much more Christians here than Muslims, to exaggerate the religious component of it in order to get more support. So we have to be, with all of these things in world affairs, I really I look at the role that we are personally playing in these conflicts. Are we making a constructive difference, as the U.S. government, or just as a citizen? And so if I can just finish with one point, I know there's a long answer, but one of the insights that I thought was wonderful that I was given by a bishop in Nigeria was that if Muslims knew Islam better, and if Christians knew Christianity better, we'd actually get along better. If we were both more religious in our own ways, then those things that we share, the human security dimensions that we both share, would be better resolved. So thanks so much.
Yeah, briefly, to respond to her question with regard to Sharia. I think if you look at Sharia in Nigeria, just look at it historically, anthropologically, and psychologically. Historically, the whole idea of Sharia in Nigeria came as part of the public policy of British colonialism. The English created a triple-decker bus. You have the common law of the Anglo-Saxon as the dominant law. Then the Muslims were elevated to their domain of Islamic Sharia without hudud. Without hudud, if you are familiar with the narrative. That means to say, you are not going to have any cutting of hand as in classical Islam. So now the English allow the Nigerians to have what I call defang Sharia existed. Community law, you have Hadis who were there. This was during the colonial period. So when independence came, some of the politicians in Nigeria from the north tried to smuggle the Sharia into the narrative. That was why when you had that big debate on the Sharia, it's part of the Nigerian story. And of course, when they restore civilian rule and they move in 79, Shehu Shagari came, that was put in cold storage. The Iranian Revolution and the agitation of these Islamic groups around the world, and the Yani Salah movement, if you know the Nigerian story, the Yani Salah is part of your story. When you have those groups that were now trying to revive Islam, and you now begin to have groups, we talk about the Maitasine group. The Maitasine group, they are a heretical group, theologically speaking. Those people did not have any standing intellectually among Muslims in Nigeria or overseas. But the Sharia, Boko Haram was on the same narrative. So when you talk about Sharia really in Nigeria, think about the fact that if you're a Nigerian, before these state politicians decided in those states to elevate Sharia to national level, that was not the case. That's why in Nigeria they have the metaphor of the Kaduna Muslim. Because these are Muslims who drink alcohol. Well, now the Kaduna Mafia is a group.
Really, really brief.
I just want to, I'm glad there's so many questions. I just want to really underline something that Gus said to relate it directly back to Boko Haram when he talked about exploiting religion for these other causes, because I think he's right. And the lesson is that it's very important for us to notice how much Boko Haram's efforts to exploit religion have failed. And that's really, really important for us to think about. And that's precisely what the most senior northern politician in the National Assembly told me a few weeks ago. He said, look, they're just bombing all these different places and attacking all these different places, trying to figure out which constituency is going to support them. And it's not working very well. And we should take some stock from that, and we should gravitate towards policies that reinforce that.
Yes, sir, here in the front. You might identify yourself since we don't know everybody here.
Sure. My name is Ni Akwete. I used to work for an NGO here called African Action. The moderator, the director, said that we should ask 35,000 questions
Okay.
The State Department official mentioned, Assistant Secretary Carson spoke at CSIS on Monday on Nigeria, and he went into a lot of detail and what the U.S. will be doing. 3 weeks ago, the Senate held hearings in which they touched on the same issue. So, in fact, I think if you listen carefully, it seems to me the U.S. is working its way towards a particular response to Boko Haram. And one aspect of that concerns me, and I think it's reflected both in the State Department officials' point and my friend Professor Levan's paper, which he was kind enough to let me read. So the argument there is what I call the Northern Poverty Diagnosis. That is that Boko Haram is in the north for a large reason because the north is much poorer than the south. And when you look at some of these emerging apparent strategies from the U.S., both in the Senate and AID and others, it's like, well, we need to encourage Nigeria to tackle poverty in the north. Even AID and other open a consulate in the north. Now, it seems to me that might be a warped strategy. So what I want to do is just point out to you why I think it's wrong, and you tell me why I am wrong. I don't think causality has been proven that it is poverty in the north that causes Boko Haram. That's my first point. We haven't proven that it is the cause. Secondly, it seems to me that one of the most difficult things for any society to do, government, is to eradicate poverty everywhere. I see here in this country that in the past few years, poverty has been increasing. And so if the idea is, well, to deal with Boko Haram, you have to eliminate poverty, it seems to me that's an impossible job. And the other reason why I don't think it's a good idea is because it seems to me that it sends a bad message to other poor Nigerians. Let's not forget that while a lot of Nigerians, there are several rich Nigerians, most Nigerians are very poor. They live on $2 a day. And so if the idea comes across that the way to fight poverty is for government involvement, and the way to get government attention is to engage in violence. If you reward Boko Haram that way, there are a lot of other regions and ethnic groups and areas of Nigeria that might get that wrong idea. So that's my fear and my problem with this approach of let's fight poverty in the north as a way of eliminating Boko Haram. I'm not saying not fighting poverty is a good idea. It's a great idea. But let's not make it that it is because of Boko Haram. Please tell me why I'm wrong.
I'll just pass the mic at this point.
I will.
Okay. There is an aspect that I'm agreeing with you in terms of looking at it as just a poverty issue. There are many areas of the world where people are even poorer and they don't take up arms. And when we go to invest in those areas to eradicate poverty, we have to look at the feudal system that is still hanging culturally in these regions, because there's a kind of Reaganomics, that you have trickle down economics, in the north there, that if you enrich a few of the elites, then they in turn will pass the wealth around, and each time there is an effort to either engage in education and healthcare, these few elites hijack the process. In fact, most of the Nigerian millionaires are up in the north. They are not most. There are many. In fact, Africa's richest person, and according to Forbes magazine, the 51st richest person in the world is a northern Nigerian Muslim.
But he lives in Lagos.
Yeah, but the point is, yeah, that's the point, that these elites who are northerners use the north. One of the things I was trying to show, that the federal government become an arena of contest for entitlement. But they get the entitlement, they don't invest it there, they invest it in Lagos, they invest it in Washington, they invest it in Paris, they invest it elsewhere. I mean, I could go down the list of people. So that has to be weighed very carefully before we think that that is the solution, because I don't think it's going to solve it. However, the idea of, quote, elevating the poor out of poverty, I'm totally in agreement, but not as a way of solving violence. We have to look at other areas, because this violence is really anchored in sectarianism, and that aspect needs also to be looked into.
I mean, I have to say that I agree with most of what you said, that there's not a direct causality between poverty and extremism, that you don't want to reward violence by, and that's part of the criticism for the Niger Delta amnesty program. In addition, it's very difficult to eradicate. So all those things are true. There's also some additional truths that I want to put on top of that. Even though there's no direct causality between poverty and extremism, when you have poverty, when you have a government that's not accountable, then it allows for certain narratives about society to be around. And I mentioned some of them before. Government doesn't care about us. Government is corrupt. Government is in our way of a better life. So that's often out there. And although, so USAID and others have done studies on this, I'm not just making it up. So what they have found is that undemocratic systems that aren't delivering services then are vulnerable to extremist groups, because extremist groups are able to take local grievances and connect them to global grievances. And they talk about past injustices and connect them to current injustices. And that is one of the most important drivers of extremism. And so when I say, or when other people in the State Department say that you have to address this northern poverty problem, that is in part what we're trying to get at. You're trying to get at not only the problem, which is worth solving for its own benefit, which you also mentioned, but also to get at that narrative that government doesn't care, the government's corrupt, the government's in your way, because that's one of the greatest drivers of extremism, or pulling people into extremism. The other main driver is actually just small group dynamics. So if you're hanging out with the wrong group of people, you get pulled in, and there's very little that we can do about that. That's mostly sort of police work on a local level. But as diplomats, or as the Nigerian government, we can affect the narrative. And so one of the things that we're recommending for the government is to not only do these socioeconomic things, but do these important symbolic moves that demonstrate to northern populations that government is on your side. And so I had mentioned some of them already too, that when you appoint somebody that's going to be head of northern issues in your cabinet, that doesn't make the problem solve away, but it does address the narrative.
The gentleman here on my left, yeah. You sir, yes.
Okay. My name is Luis Serapiano. I'm from Mozambique, and I teach in Howard University. I was listening to you when you were trying to explain why the North shouldn't split from the West. The main argument was that the North is poor. That's what I mean. This problem or this issue could be applied to Mozambique. For a long time, we used to say that the North could not split because the North was poor. The North was underdeveloped. Very interesting. Now, Mozambique, I was reading newspapers. They are calling Mozambique separation. Because when I look at political power, there are three elements very important. It's quality, it's quantity, and economic resource. These are the three things which are the source of political power. In the beginning, the South did not have quality because they were not educated. And then they were poor. So to advocate for separation was not, an acceptable proposition. Now, here's what we do. Put in university, and now we are having universities, public universities in the north, to correct that quality. The quality power. They are correcting the quality power. Quantitatively, the north has, the majority is the number. Now, economically, we are superpower energy. Question, should we split? Should we advocate?
I'm not sure we have anybody capable of talking about Mozambique on the panel, but perhaps we can just focus that on the northern question. And I think that Father Okure first made the argument that the North couldn't split because of the poverty situation. Do you want to follow up on that, Father?
Yeah, I made an input earlier on that yes, splitting is not an issue in Nigeria now. It would have been 30 years ago, not anymore. And actually, I want to touch on something else that that he touched on, namely to try to, how do you create the imbalance, or how do you correct the imbalance in the country? Nigeria has tried to correct the imbalance. Unfortunately, it has not been well followed up. It instituted something called, let's have, quote, a national character of Nigeria, namely that in government, let it be representative of everybody, from north and south, east and west, Christians and Muslims. Number one. Secondly, in education, there is what is called, quote, catchment areas. In fact, until recently, all the universities in Nigeria were operated by the government. And so if the university is in Maiduguri, in Sokoto, in Kaduna, in Enugu, a percentage of admission was limited to the indigenes where the university is located. So there were many programs implemented by the government to correct the imbalance after independence. However, unfortunately, most of these programs were not followed through. And in terms of creating a national character, like have these people represented in government, it often ended up that, quote, man no man, that you end up not with the most qualified, even though that area must have had a very well qualified person, but because you know me, you bring me in. So it ended up corrupting the system. Yeah. It was a very excellent program, but it ended up corrupting the system, which has continued. And and again, to the whole idea of rotating government, president from the north, president from the south, why that is there, it's really a one-party agreement. It is the PDP, the ruling party now. The rest of Nigeria don't like that. In fact, there is really a resentment that a particular party is holding Nigeria to this rotational agreement. And I think that the next two presidential elections will be telling, because some people are very angry about that. They might decide to be voting for people in other parties. And we have seen that already replicated in some state level, that smaller parties have won on the state level, and hopefully that might be reflected in the, in the federal government.
We have time for one more question. So let me go to one of the ladies. Yes, ma'am. I had two questions, one on education and a very hot political question that I'm not going to touch. Who would like to speak? Professor Levin?
All right, I'll be quick. Yeah, I think education is the long-term investment for development in the North. I would specify that a little bit further and say education of girls. You know, one of the single most important things any country in Africa or in the developing world can do to invest in the long-term future is to send girls to school. And the reason for that is because it is a perfect inverse correlation between the number of years you are in school and the number of children that you have. In other words, the longer you're in school, the more you know, the fewer children you have. The fewer children you have, the higher per capita GDP, the higher the level of wealth in the country, and the higher the productivity towards the economy, and so forth and so on. It's very tricky to translate those simple empirical facts into something that makes sense on the ground. And the development agencies and lots of people, I think, struggle with that. IBB support for Boko Haram, it's really important. I mean, this is floating around there a lot, and this was in the newspapers when I was there, and it's really important to note, again, that the escalation of Boko Haram began in 2009, almost exactly 2 years before the election in 2011, and before Yarodua even became ill. So, you know, that's point number one. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about North and South and the secession and so forth. I'm happy to talk a little bit afterwards. In the last 50 years in Africa, only 2 secessionist movements have succeeded. And secession was a very popular political platform in the North until about 1965. What happened in 1965, oil revenues started to pick up. They went from 5% to about 70% in a period of 5 years. Let me tell you, it took no time at all for secession to disappear from the agenda of the North.
Just to add to talk about education of women, you remember one of the maps that I placed side by side, female literacy and child health. One of the things that has been proven beyond doubt is that the education of the mother, you know, children's education, you know, there's a correlation between educating the mother and having educated children. Actually, more so than it would be with the dad. So, yes, education of women is crucial. And then there is this problem, and that goes to a very tricky problem, that these radical groups think that educating girls is a sinful project, you know? Yeah. So you have that dynamic. So how do you overcome this radical view, which in Saudi Arabia, they're opening up universities left, right, and center. New universities are being built, and girls are going to school. In fact, actually, 2 years ago, I had a Saudi Arabian young Muslim girl in class here at Catholic University. So, and yet, the group in Nigeria think that educating women is not a good idea. I don't know which brand of Islam is that one.
No, I think the question you're raising with regard to education in northern Nigeria, I think these are just distortions in the Nigerian experience. I think what you have to recognize is that before the Europeans came, Usman Dan Fodio's people were very educated. They were literate. The problem you have in northern Nigeria is that you have a combination of poverty and political use of these people you are describing, the Ahmadiyyaras, those people who go and beg in the streets. That is an illustration of the class struggle in northern Nigeria. Why would you be a billionaire, you live in Lagos instead of in Kano or where you live in the north? Because you're protecting yourself. You see, the problem you have in northern Nigeria is that you have many of those elites who are using their privileged positions to enrich themselves, and they can hide, define any kind of narrative of their choice. Now, that is the educational factor. The evidence is very much there. There are research on Nigerian education, and you can see certainly the difference between the southern performance and the northern performance. The other point I want to address with regard to whether the North should secede or not. If you look at the Nigerian narrative again, there was the concept of Pakistanization of Nigeria. That was the language of Azikiwe. They were afraid that the Northerners were going to break away from Nigeria, as Pakistan broke away from India. That was the narrative in Nigeria, the Pakistanization of the country. We don't want these Northerners to be seceded from the country. And of course, that lost. In 65, what he just said, when the oil revenue came, that idea is no longer popular in the North. You see, I think that is the way we have to look at the historical narrative. Let us not be fooled. Now, there is a talk that Babangida is behind all this Boko Haram. That's a talk. We cannot prove it. As a scholar, I will not put my name on it unless I have the evidence. If the FBI comes around and gives me the evidence, I will publish it. But I don't have the evidence. But the rumor is out there.
Well, we've run out of time. Thank you all very much. If there are some additional questions, I think the panelists would be glad to answer them privately. Thank you all very much for attending.